Hey, Al, can you hear me okay? Because I'm a little concerned that you guys are frozen. Okay, I see you nodding your head. Okay, I'll go back on mute.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to have you here today. We're continuing our series this month of conversations with agencies, organizations, elected officials, appointed officials, all united in bringing an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic to residents of Minnesota. And I'm pleased today to have Senator Bobby Champion, who represents District 59, a DFLer from North Minneapolis and downtown, and also Commissioner Mary Catherine Rickert, who is the Commissioner of Education for the state of Minnesota. And we want to talk about what we're doing as a state. I want to first say both thank you and welcome to Senator Champion, because you led the charge in organizing the Black community and communities of color so that we could be both aware and responsive and engaged, and most importantly, involved in the work of informing our communities about the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of your work and your colleagues, I call you guys the dynamic duo, you and Senator Jeff Hayden, and others like Senator Fooley and Senator Fong, her, and Senator Franson, Representative
Rena Moran.
Rena Moran, thank you, thank you. But all of you together worked with the governor and his team to craft an engagement strategy. So I wanted you to talk about how important it is, what your findings have been, how important it is to keep the community engaged and in an equity position in the fight against COVID-19. What are your thoughts, Senator Champion?
Well, first of all, Al, thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for just your continued commitment and dedication to all communities, but especially people of color. When you think in terms of this unprecedented pandemic that we are dealing with, we know that there's been over 300,000 people who's lost their life. And you can think in terms of the millions of people who've been affected by COVID. Not to mention that when you think about those who have been most impacted by those numbers have been people of color. We know that largely it is because they're frontline employees or what some people call it essential employees. We know also that so many folks in communities of color have underlying medical conditions, and the list goes on and on that puts them more at risk. What we were finding early on, and why the governor was very responsive to our call when we said that there are these communities who are receiving misinformation or no information at all, and if you want to engage them, that we have to utilize trusted sources to get that information to those folks. So that's why we came together as ethnic media on various levels and combined our efforts in order to make sure that we were making sure folks were fully aware, of some of the misinformation. There was misinformation at one time that only the more seasoned ones in life would be impacted by COVID. But now we see that there are young people who are affected by COVID. At one time, people were saying that if you were a person with melanin in your skin, that you wouldn't get COVID, right? And so that was debunked because we were dealing with an unprecedented pandemic. But here's what's also important. Now that we've gone through, we're continuing to engage people. People understand the importance of wearing masks and washing their hands. And if they don't feel well, stay home. But now we have on the horizon, and in some cities already, a vaccine, right? And folks have been vaccinated or inoculated, whichever word you care to use. But we have to now have a different strategy with the same group of people to talk about what have been the historical trauma or challenges between people of color and the government and the medical profession, especially if you want the folks that we just articulated that are most at risk and that also need to be inoculated or accept the vaccination, we have to make sure that they feel comfortable and trusting of the government. You know, with African Americans, you can think about the Tuskegee experiment or Harriet Martineau or just a number of different folks. You just name it. There's some challenge that has caused um, uh, us not to trust the government, and so we have to do a interesting job now to re-engage people, let them know that it's safe, that this is not an experiment that is like the bad blood where they had injected black men with syphilis in 1932 and then they didn't even come back around until 1972. So it's 40 years of that sort of challenge. So all that is to say, and I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but I think we had to put it in context from the very beginning and where we are now and how this worked to make sure that communities of color and our trusted voices are engaged in real time in order to speak truth and to develop trust, but also develop an implementable strategy in order to make sure that both of those things can coexist with each other.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane, our special series every day, 7 days a week, at the noon hour, talking to leaders and community about Minnesota's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our thanks to the Minnesota Department of Health for funding this series, and thanks to my guest today, Senator Bobby Joe Champion and Commissioner Mary Catherine Ricker, who heads the Education Department of Minnesota. Let me take a minute, Bobby, and you probably will be embarrassed by me saying all of this, but I think it's fun to tell people who you are and where you're coming from, because it all adds up to the power you bring to the equation. Senator Bobby Champion attended North High School right here in the neighborhood that I'm in right now, where Insight's located, and where I live. He graduated with degrees in political science and law. He went to Macalester College for the bachelor's and to William Mitchell College of Law. He's a practicing attorney. His skill set includes negotiation, legal and business analysis, and advocacy. He himself has been a lifelong resident of North Minneapolis and currently lives in North Minneapolis' Lynn Park neighborhood with his wife, Angela, who's a pharmacist, and their two sons. Champion says he used to love watching courtroom dramas like Perry Mason when he was a kid, and when he graduated from high school, decided he wanted to be a lawyer, but he's also passionate about music and has developed a career both in music and in entertainment law. His passion for music and the arts grew from directing his church choir and a personal choir called Excelsior. Excelsior developed into a stellar award-winning and Grammy-nominated choir and went on to receive nationwide exposure, producing over 7 CDs. Bobby Champion has also worked with and for Flight Time Productions and for the Grammy award-winning producers, Terry Lewis and Jimmy Jam Harris. And I could keep going on, Bobby, probably embarrassing you a little bit by the accolades, but I can tell you that the accolades you've earned and that I'm sharing are ones that are exactly that, things that you've earned, things you've done, and we celebrate you for your work. And so as we move from the initial engagement of you bringing all of us to the table and encouraging successfully that the state embark on a strategy of inclusion, of investing in the assets of the community in the fight against COVID, how do we move that forward as we have a vaccine on the horizon and we have the challenge that you just described of believability or of doubt and hesitation in our community based on real experiences with the medical and research establishment? How do we move forward? How do we keep and expand the engagement?
Well, thank you for that question. And yes, you did embarrass me about all the other things, right? I'm proud of those things, but I'm also just very proud of being in the position where I am and still doing those music things. Because we can talk about music for the holidays. It's a show that I developed that's being aired tomorrow night on TPT from 7 to 8:30. So go to TPT Minnesota, and you'll get a chance to see that aspect of my life. Secondly, being a lawyer is something that I practice every single day. And in fact, that whole connection about Perry Mason, I'm reading Barack Obama's book called The Promised Land.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentions that he was inspired by Perry Mason as well. So that's like funny as well.
You're in good company. Yeah.
But he talked about, even in that book, and why this is so important, the importance of the work and advocacy and being in the right positions to really have a wide reach and to have major impact. And so I'm proud that the governor has been very thoughtful about these things. So in fact, when I was on with the governor about a week ago, he raised this issue with me as well. Like, how do we get those trusted voices back to the table? How do we make sure that we make those necessary investments and resource those entities that we had around the table before? And so the Minnesota Department of Health, and we sent out a notice, are going to put forth some revenue and resources for those trusted voices to be re-engaged, for those mechanisms to be fired up again. You guys have been doing it for quite some time, but to just really make sure that you are resourced and utilizing the faith community as well, right? So before the governor and I met with, even around the ethnic media, we met with faith leaders. Now we're going to engage those faith leaders and other leaders as well, so that their voices can be heard around a strategy and getting their questions answered, but also for them to perhaps take the vaccination in person as well, right? Because we need to speak truth to power, but also make sure that we're looking out for the people who trust us, right? So when I was on, Camel J the other day, someone texted me and said, "Hey, because you said it's safe and that we should, I'm willing to give it a shot, even though, no pun intended, even though I wasn't thinking about it before."
Great.
So I think it's all hands on deck. We got to resource those individuals who are trusted and credible voices in our community. We then have to use our reach to talk and answer the questions for our community, not just have them say, "No, just do it," but talk through with them. That there were African Americans who were part of the CDC team or the FDA who looked at the emergency notion, that Black doctors have been engaged and say that they believe it's safe because we've gone through the paces and the protocol. Distinguish the difference between bad blood and this unprecedented pandemic, right? So that people have information, but also creating opportunities for them to not just understand, but advocate, and then for us to look forward. So that's what I think, that we have to go back to the table, continue to engage the governor and the administration. I'm happy that you have the Commissioner of Education on, because I think the other component, when we think in terms of this pandemic, is education. Our kids were already well behind, or there were those achievement gaps, right? Or I like to call opportunity gaps. It's only they haven't just experienced the pandemic slide, they now experience the summer slide with a new pandemic slide, and it just seems to be going further and further back. And I hope that the commissioner will talk about what is the plan and the strategy to really make sure that we're taking the affirmative steps forward, because our kids are losing this battle, and I'm concerned about us losing a generation or two because of the current situation that we find ourselves in. And so we have to continue to engage, and engage comprehensively, not to mention the fact that parents are pulling their hair out because they've been required to be at that computer. And then you got the whole notion around internet accessibility, right? So it's a vast issue that it must be dealt with on the level of complexity that it presents. But specifically to your question, we will be talking soon, and I know Shamika has sent out to that group as well the announcement of additional resources and plans and thoughts and ideas. And we hope that you all, with the same level of vigor and enthusiasm that we gather around the table before, that you will continue to gather, and for us all to move forward, and this to be a catalyst even beyond the pandemic, for everyone to see the importance of this coalition and ethnic media, and not just users during this unprecedented time, but understand that we are a part of the change that they should embrace, and that we need to be very intentional about our future. So that's what I think.
Bobby Joe Champion, thank you so much. Stick around as long as you can, because I want to bring the commissioner in. You opened the door for the conversation. Let me introduce her by saying that Commissioner Mary Catherine Ricker, thank you for being here, was appointed by Governor Tim Walz, who himself is an educator. And, she's a native of Hibbing, national board certified middle school English teacher with over a decade of classroom experience. She's taught in classrooms from St. Cloud to Washington to South Korea to Yemen. She's been around. Spent a large part of her career teaching middle school English in St. Paul Public Schools, and previously served as Executive Vice President of the American Federation of Teachers and as President of the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, AFT Local 26. So her teaching and leadership skills have been recognized with a number of honors, including the Education Minnesota Peterson Schaubach Outstanding Leadership Award, and she was a qualified semifinalist to the NEA Foundation Award for Teaching Excellence. She served as a featured contributor to the Annenberg Foundation's National Professional Development Series called Right in the Middle. She's a third generation teacher. Her grandfather and father were both teachers on the Iron Range. She earned degrees in English with a math minor at University of St. Thomas, and completed her graduate work in teacher leadership training at University of Minnesota. Her husband teaches English language learners in the St. Paul Public Schools, and they have two children, one in St. Paul Public Schools and one in college. Mary Catherine Ricker, thank you so much and welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Respond directly, if you would, to the challenging questions raised by Senator Champion. How do we keep the double impact of COVID-19 and social unrest from further setting back Black and Brown minority students in Minnesota?
So thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to Senator Champion for framing that and just being able to jump in here, because he is absolutely right. Before this pandemic hit, we were already struggling to close achievement gaps and end discipline disparities in our schools. And so going into the pandemic, we knew that even our emergency distance learning last spring needed to have a foundation in equity. And so when we talked to every group I could talk to, school leaders, educators, community members, when we talked about equitable distance learning, I described it as building equity at the base and building out from there. So think of students who needed the greatest accommodations in our brick and mortar settings, and build the accommodations for equitable distance learning for them first, and then build out a distance learning plan from there. And that is how we are going to try to continue to meet the needs of students, as we recognize we had disparities before, and then we started noticing last spring even disparities growing. The digital divide, whether it be access to devices or or connectivity, we started noticing that. We certainly noticed how difficult it was for students to adapt to a new schedule. Students came from incredibly structured days to something called asynchronous learning. And they ended up with additional responsibilities. Sometimes they were perhaps responsible for younger siblings, perhaps to share a device in the family. There were a lot of things our students were navigating that they hadn't navigated before the pandemic. And we wanted to build in expectations for our schools all along the way. We put together a series of professional development seminars last spring, in fact, that 18,000 teachers attended in real time because they were that hungry to figure out how to better meet the needs of students in this unprecedented setting. And they've been archived on our website and downloaded countless times since. And then going into summer learning, That was when we first introduced the concept of hybrid learning, making sure that students could be in person very carefully, right, with all our safety and health accommodations expected. Then asking our school communities to perhaps prioritize that in-person learning for the students who they struggled the most in meeting their needs that spring. And so in every step, we have thought of the sort of new barriers that this pandemic has created, and tried to address them, tried to make sure our school communities have those accommodations. And then to Senator Champion's point, looking ahead, we are going to keep that momentum of looking at what are those new barriers that got put up, what are the old barriers we're still looking to break down, and build in the opportunity, again, to prioritize in-person learning wherever we can, add those safety measures, and then out even into next summer, then what does a really enhanced, enriched summer learning opportunity look like based on what we learned last summer and based on what we're learning in those successful situations that we've been experiencing through this school year as well.
Is the end of the education disparity in sight? Is that something that we can conceive of as an achievable goal? We've been sort of marveling at this problem for a generation. It certainly has not gone away. We talk about it, we examine it, and it persists. What do you think? Is there a strategy, a possibility of genuine transformation that leads us to a place where there is no disparity of opportunity and of education outcomes for all the children and families of Minnesota? What are your thoughts?
I am going to say an enthusiastic yes, grounded in several things. First, grounded in the belief that if I'm going to do it, I actually have to dream it as education commissioner, and I have to dream it into existence for our school communities as well. And to say that the end in sight for discipline disparities as well as achievement gaps is there, then that tells us that we are going to make progress, that there is no alternative but to make progress. And so there's my first yes. My second yes really comes from some of what we've learned in school communities through the pandemic. And that is that there has been an upheaval. That is the absolute truth. Within that upheaval, our practices, I am hearing from our school communities, from teachers, from principals, from students and families, that they actually feel work better for them or actually help create stronger relationships in their schools. They actually don't want to give up when this pandemic is over, right? Because we are going to get back to that place. And, you know, you've probably heard the governor and lieutenant governor say, let's go back to better. Let's not go back to the way things were. And I think taking those opportunities where our school community has identified things, I can just use one.
We've got a signal challenge here, I think. Let me mute my... yeah, Brenda, mute your microphone because we've got a bandwidth issue.
One example is attendance. It maybe took, well, what our teachers did last spring is they changed attendance into relationship building opportunities where they used attendance, not, accountability was certainly in the background, but attendance was actually more focused on just really connecting with students. How are you doing today? Describe the way you are feeling. Tell me, tell me a little bit about yourself. And what I am hearing is that they don't want to get rid of that. They want to actually be like front load every day with students because emergency in the pandemic situation. The other thing I would say is we have been incubating some practices that are improving the way we meet the needs of students. And the time is ripe because our schools are looking to, again, prioritize in-person learning. We're going to get out of this pandemic a number of different ways. You hear it from my colleagues in the Department of Health. what those steps are to contain this pandemic. And so now is the time to take those promising practices we've been incubating and really build them out to scale. Welcome students back with programs we've seen that are successful, like Check and Connect, or like full service community schools, or other things we've been incubating across the state that have really been known to meet the needs of our students.
So, I've described, and I hear described the time we're in as a time of transformation, and you're describing what we may evolve towards at the other end of the spectrum. Describe to me the picture, your dream of what our schools will be like, what our education apparatus will be like coming through this, I call it the twin pandemics, the one of COVID-19, but the other is the pandemic of 1619, the question of the impact of slavery and structural racism, both of which work together to deny opportunity and access to Black and brown people in the country. So how do you see us looking? How does this moment force us to be transformed and to be better, to be our better selves? What do you think?
I appreciate the framing of that so much, because it goes to what we've learned about ourselves as educators across the state and what we've learned about our school communities. And that is that dramatic transformation actually can take place. To your point earlier about sort of admiring and sort of examining problems, being really deliberative about our next steps, that deliberation is important because we always want to make progress with our next steps. We never want to be able, we never want to do something that actually further sets us back. And at the same time, seeing those twin pandemics sort of hit our school communities and having them react, where I found people leading with relationships, realizing that strong teaching and learning conditions absolutely meet the academic needs of our students. That's always been true. And those strong learning conditions meet the social and emotional needs of our students, checking in with them, making sure there is a support network for them as a way to access that academic knowledge and those academic moments. And all of that, meeting the needs of students academically as well as socially and emotionally, needs to happen in a safe and welcoming environment. And I saw our school communities in particular this May and June, as they saw the larger community environment with the murder of George Floyd really impact the way students were showing up in their classrooms, or perhaps not, because distance learning and students perhaps in a protective mode just stopped coming. Our educators wanting to react to that in real time, not examine it, not study it, but make sure students, reaching out to students and families to know that, like, I miss you, I see you, I hear you, and I am going to make sure that my classroom practice welcomes you. And seeing those sorts of transformational changes actually is another reason I say yes to the earlier question, because these twin pandemics have hit our school communities in ways that, with an urgency that we talked about in the past, perhaps, but now is palpable. It is absolutely palpable.
Brenda Gray and I, Brenda is on the call. She's a reporter and writer, editor for Insight News, writing the stories of these conversations. Brenda, you can join me in this if you want to, but we both were kindergarten classmates in Kansas City growing up. So I've known Brenda since I was 5 years old. But one of the existential threats for our lives back in that era was the possibility of nuclear war. Brenda, if you remember, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, 6th grade, we were all up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, training for what if an atomic bomb came. And there was discussion in families and communities about shelter for atomic bombs, what you do in classroom, get under the desk if that's going to keep you from getting melted and toasted. But that was the existential threat that the entire world and certainly our community faced. That's at the same time dealing with the very present impact of racism, segregation, the fight for liberation. So those things happened then. And I'm thinking about how trauma was experienced by us and in the lives of our community. And that leads to the question, Commissioner, how do you feel students and teachers are addressing or responding to the trauma, both of the threat of COVID-19 and the challenges associated with the murder of George Floyd, the quest for justice, and the bearing of that ugly institutional history of our country? What do you think about that?
It is a conversation that has been elevated like never before. The conversation has been in our school communities. It has certainly been with a lot of the school climate center work being done at the Minnesota Department of Education. It has been focused on before. We have an opportunity now because the wondering, the urgency of determining how we address trauma. At the same time, we provide that educational experience our students deserve is so much in the forefront that there are no more discussions, or the discussion perhaps has receded about, do you provide counselors and social workers, or do you provide stronger academics? That's not a question. Our students deserve both. They deserve our best efforts as educators, and they deserve that attention to their social emotional well-being, to know that whether I am meeting with my teacher on a Google Meets or whether I get to go back to my classroom, that I feel seen and I am heard, I am safe, I am welcomed, and I am ready to learn. That those things work in concert. And the better we do as educators to build relationships with our students and make sure students understand why we care so deeply about them being there, the more our students will recognize that actually what it is we have to teach them is something that we are bringing to them in that spirit of I care about you, therefore I want you to learn this, right? It is an old adage for a reason, because it endures in us, that I don't care what you know until I know you care. And that is absolutely front and center, because our students deserve both. They deserve to know they are cared about, and they deserve to know we absolutely have aspirations for them academically as well.
Brenda, what are your thoughts? Brenda is an educator as well, and I know this is a passion of yours, Brenda. Any observations or comments about the challenge of the education institution in our country, and the role of understanding our cultural truths and our ethnic truths? What do you think?
Good afternoon, Commissioner.
Good afternoon.
One of the things I was thinking about in listening to you is, first of all, the overwhelming challenge that you're facing and that teachers are facing, because they have families too. They have gone through this. So we have to be careful about them and how they are feeling with all of the extra work that it's going to entail to embrace our children. And our Black children are really, really hurting. They don't know what to think, and it's their parents that are not there in the home to monitor their online learning because they have to work. So there's so many layers, but as educators, as parents, we can't be overwhelmed. We've got to start somewhere, and you're starting at a real good place. And I congratulate you and wish you the very best. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to call for a sacrifice from everyone, because they come first. They're a priority.
Well, Commissioner, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today. I want to ask you if there's anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners, any instruction or any invitations, any way that you can advise us all to be more effective in cooperating to protect and create sustainability and progress in our families, our communities, and our learning environment?
I will just say that we at the Department of Education, we are working elbow to elbow with our colleagues at the Department of Health, and we are going to continue to share those, conditions that create a safe and healthy place for our students to learn with these safe learning plans. It is imperative to us that we prioritize our students in person wherever it is safe and healthy to do so, and then making sure that we provide the conditions for that safety and for that health. And so our commitment to you is that we are going to continue to work alongside health as we learn more about this virus, the way it behaves in our broader communities, the way it behaves in our school communities, and those measures we can take to prevent transmission, particularly in our school communities. We are going to make sure we educate our school communities across the state of Minnesota for that, and make sure that we prioritize returning to in-person learning where it is safe and healthy to do so, because we want our students to know that the Minnesota Department of Education cares deeply about all of them and their families as well. They mean the world to us, and seeing them in person again would be, it's something we are all working towards.
That brings a final question, and that is that I guess last night, the legislature approved a $908 billion bill to support COVID-19 relief initiatives. And I think in that amount was about $7 billion or $10 billion for education. I think that's the number. I could be wrong. But if that is the number, how much of that comes to Minnesota? What are you looking for? And what will you do with it? Is it enough? And how have you been able to create the physical conditions that improve safety and make being together in a classroom a safe experience for young people, and therefore for the families that they touch throughout their living their day? And we can wrap up on that, but address that, please.
Yes, no, thank you for asking. So it's actually something my colleagues at the Department of Education and I are digging into right now to determine what will be coming to the state of Minnesota. In fact, later this afternoon, I hope to get more information. And just to preview by reviewing, when we got the CARES Act dollars and the coronavirus relief funds back last spring, we prioritized what we heard coming from the school communities, what they needed the most. So prioritized that money for technology, both devices and connectivity. We prioritized it for enhancing mental health services because of that toll the pandemic has been taking on our students, making sure we could enhance mental health services wherever possible. And so I would also anticipate, once we learn more, thinking through the same thing, listening to our school communities, to our students and their families and our educators to determine what is it you need to be best supported now. When we announced our safe learning plans for this fall, we made a commitment to our school communities that we would buy face masks for every student as well as every adult in our school buildings. We also made the commitment to prioritize those at-home tests for our educators. Well, now, of course, we've expanded testing dramatically across the state. So many more people have access to tests. And we are still making those commitments by also making sure that masks and face shields are getting into our school communities, because we have found that is an even a more effective barrier to transmission in our schools. So we're taking some of those lessons from some of those previous federal dollars, and we'll be applying them to our opportunities to invest in in-person instruction where it's safe and healthy to do so with these dollars as well.
How about things like fixing airflow, or at least consideration of how the air exchange system works to mitigate the collection of bad air, so to speak? What do you think? Is that part of what you're doing?
Our school finance division has been working with school communities, and actually this predates the pandemic. Certainly when there are big capital projects, our school finance division has been working with our school communities to address that. Also making sure that where there are projects that aren't universal across the state of Minnesota, knowing that our school communities, perhaps if they want to spread students out, and they need to perhaps do their own investments in maybe plexiglass dividers and things, that they also can use some of the funding for those localized priorities as well.
Commissioner, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Continued success and kudos to you and your team for doing what you're doing. And you are welcome to come back to conversations with Al McFarlane anytime, and to use Insight News and our other media platforms to keep the connection with our communities going. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Please continue to take care of yourself.
Thank you.
And happy holidays.
Same to you.